The slap cracked across the morning air like a gunshot. Every worker on the Kaduna construction site froze, hands stilled on scaffolding poles, a radio somewhere cut out mid-song. Even the dry Harmattan wind seemed to hold its breath. And Musa Idris, the man who secretly owned every brick, every beam, every square meter of ground beneath their feet, stood with his jaw turned sideways, dust settling on his worn kaftan, and said absolutely nothing. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Aisha Believa said, loud enough for the entire site to hear. She stood in heels that had no business being on unpaved ground, a silk wrapper draped over her shoulders, her fingers still trembling from the force of what she had done. Her driver lingered 10 feet behind her, eyes carefully averted. "I heard you had nothing left. I came to see if it was true. And look at you. Look at what you have become." Moose's cheek burned. He kept his eyes low. Around him, workers exchanged looks, some stifled laughter. One man near the cement mixer muttered something in Hausa that drew a short burst of amusement from the others. A younger apprentice, barely 20, openly grinned. Nobody rushed to defend the quiet laborer in the dusty boots. Why would they? He was nobody, a man who ate from an aluminum plate beside a kerosene lamp every night, a man who carried iron rods on his shoulder and fixed scaffolding errors that the foreman kept ignoring. Nobody. Aisha stepped closer. Her perfume was expensive and completely wrong for this place. "My father told me," she said quietly now, almost private, which was somehow worse than the public version. "He said your company collapsed, that you have nothing, that you borrowed to survive." She looked at his kaftan, at the clay stain on his left sleeve, at the cracked leather of his boots. "I want you to know that I am not angry. I am simply done." Musa raised his eyes then, just briefly, just enough for her to see whatever lived behind them. She blinked. Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, not quite, more like the sensation of having touched something she did not expect to find solid. Then it passed, and she turned, and her heels clicked twice before the soft ground swallowed the sound. He watched her go. He did not rub his cheek. He did not speak. He simply picked up the iron rod at his feet, settled it across his shoulder, and walked back toward the half-finished structure on the east end of the site. 3 weeks earlier, Musa Idris had sat at the head of a glass and steel boardroom in Abuja, listening to an anonymous audit report that made his blood run cold and his face completely still. 47 million naira, diverted, quietly, surgically, over 8 months. Not from the commercial projects, from the affordable housing scheme, from the community estate intended for 800 low-income families who had already waited 2 years, from the people who had no leverage and no lawyers and no way to fight back. He'd read the full report 3 times before trusting it. Then he commissioned a quiet verification independent of the company's internal systems. When the second report landed, it confirmed the first with additional precision. The money trail pointed inward toward the executive floor. He could have called a press conference. He could have called the police. He could have done the fast, obvious thing and watched it become a media circus that his enemies would manipulate before justice found its footing. He had seen it happen before to other men, corruption investigations that somehow ended with the investigator disgraced and the corrupt ones promoted. He was not going to be that story. Instead, he called his most trusted legal counsel, a man named Garba Sheku who had known him since university, and told him 4 things. First, freeze all access to the housing fund pending an internal lock. Second, prepare a confidential shareholder resolution transferring operational authority to a trusted deputy. Third, stage a media leak suggesting financial instability. Make it credible, make it painful. Fourth, and Garba had gone very quiet at this one, arrange casual labor documentation under a false name. He wanted a site pass, a helmet, a pair of boots. "You want to go undercover at your own construction site," Garba said slowly. I want to see what I have built when no one knows it is mine, and I want to find out who is stealing from families that cannot afford to lose anything. If Garba thought this was madness, he had the professional discipline not to say so. The fake financial scandal broke on a Friday. By Saturday, it had traveled through every elite WhatsApp group in Abuja and Lagos. By Sunday, Aisha's calls had already slowed from 4 a day to 2 a day. By Wednesday, they stopped entirely. Musa noticed. He did not mourn it. He filed it somewhere quiet and kept moving. His first day on site was the most disorienting experience of his adult life, not because the work was hard, though it was, not because the other workers treated him with indifference that bordered on contempt, though they did. It was the quality of the air that threw him. Here, in this place he had funded and designed and argued about in boardrooms, nobody owed him anything. Nobody arranged their expression before speaking to him. Nobody softened the truth to protect his feelings. A foreman named Tunde told him on day 2, loudly and without apology, that he was the slowest rod carrier on site and that if he could not improve his pace, he would be replaced by Wednesday. Musa nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and improved his pace. By the end of the first week, he had learned 3 things that no audit report had captured. The foreman was skimming materials, cheaper cement substituted in critical load-bearing sections. 2 senior site engineers knew and said nothing because Tunde's brother-in-law was connected to the procurement officer. And the workers, exhausted and underpaid, had begun to quietly accept the unsafe conditions because they needed the daily wage and had no union and no voice. He lay on a thin mattress in the empty skeleton of an unfinished unit each night and stared at the ceiling with the focused, patient attention of a man building a case. Outside, Kaduna breathed through its dust and generator hum. Dogs barked somewhere in the dark. A radio played Fela faintly from one of the other workers' camps. He was the richest man within 5 kilometers. He was eating roadside beans from a newspaper cone. And if you're watching this story right now and you feel it already pulling at something inside you, that's exactly what this story is built to do. Subscribe before the next scene because what is coming will change everything you think you know about Musa Idris. This is the kind of story you do not want to find paused at a cliffhanger with no notifications turned on. He had been on site 11 days when Safiya came. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a blue clinic uniform and worn leather sandals, carrying a medical bag in one hand and a covered pot in the other. She moved through the site with the calm of someone who had learned long ago that environments like this one would not accommodate hesitation. She set up near the water station, spread a small cloth on a concrete block, arranged her equipment, and began treating small injuries, cuts, abrasions, a sprained wrist, with the quiet competency of someone who had done this 100 times without expecting to be thanked. Musa watched her from across the yard. He watched the way she listened. Most people in positions of even minor authority, doctor, nurse, coordinator, developed a specific face when listening to someone below them in the social ladder. A polite face, a waiting face. Safiya did not have that face. When old Malam Bello showed him the infected cut on his forearm, she bent toward it with her full attention, the way you bent toward something that genuinely mattered. He went back to work. He told himself he had not been staring. An hour later, carrying a water container back from the station, he miscalculated the edge of a raised platform and the corner caught the back of his hand. The gash was not deep, but it bled immediately and with enthusiasm. He stood holding his wrist, blood threading between his fingers, calculating whether it was serious enough to stop work, when a voice reached him. "Come here, sit. Do not shake your hand like that. You are making it bleed faster." He sat on the concrete block she pointed to without argument, not because he was accustomed to taking instructions. He was not and had not been for 15 years, but because something in her voice carried the specific authority of someone who was simply right. She was right. Shaking his hand was making it bleed faster. Safiya set down her bag, snapped on a pair of thin gloves, and took his hand with the same focused attention she had given Malam Bello's arm. Her grip was firm. Professional. She tilted his hand toward the afternoon light and examined the cut without drama. "How did this happen?" she asked. Platform edge, he said. You were not watching where you were going. I was watching something else. She glanced up briefly. Her eyes were dark brown and direct, the kind that did not invite deflection. Then she looked back at the wound and reached for antiseptic. This will sting, she said. I know. Most men say they know and then flinch anyway. Then most men are liars, he said. She pressed the antiseptic cloth to the cut. He did not flinch. She noticed. She did not comment on it, but the slight adjustment in her posture told him she had registered it. She began to dress the wound with clean, efficient movements, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Around them, the site continued its noise, metal against metal, men calling across distances, the grinding procession of construction that never fully stopped. You are not from here originally, she said. It was not a question. What makes you say that? He asked. The way you speak, you are educated past what this site usually attracts. She tied off the bandage with a small, precise knot. Not that education and this site are incompatible, but you carry it differently than someone who grew up around it. Musa looked at her steadily. And you are not from the site either. No, she said simply. I am from a clinic 2 kilometers east. We come here twice a week. There is no company medical provision for these workers, which is, she paused, choosing her word with care, a problem. A significant one, he agreed. She pulled off her gloves, dropped them into a small waste bag, and looked at him with that direct gaze again. What is your name? Musa, he said, the full surname he kept. I am Sophia. She began repacking her bag. Eat something today, Musa. You look like a man who skipped lunch to keep working. That is how small injuries become large ones. The body stops compensating when it is running empty. He almost told her that he owned this site. He felt the sentence form somewhere behind his sternum, almost involuntary, the reflex of a man whose identity had been tied to ownership for so long that anonymity still felt slightly wrong, like wearing another person's shoe. He swallowed it. There is jollof at the gate, she said, already moving. Old Hajia brings it at 4. It is not bad. She walked away without looking back. Musa sat on the concrete block for a moment longer than necessary. He had negotiated contracts worth billions. He had presented to ministers and faced hostile shareholders in rooms designed to make men feel small. He had once received a standing ovation from 400 investors in Dubai for a development proposal that redefined affordable housing economics in sub-Saharan Africa. He had never, in any of those rooms, felt as precisely seen as he had in the last 7 minutes on a dusty construction site in Kaduna by a woman in a blue uniform who charged him nothing and left without ceremony. He went and found the jollof rice. The days that followed had a rhythm he had not anticipated finding meaningful. He worked, he listened, he documented, not on a phone, which would have been conspicuous, but in a small notebook he kept inside his kaftan, written in the compressed shorthand he had developed in university. What he gathered was damning and specific. Tunde, the foreman, received weekly cash payments from a man who came in a private car and never stepped out. The site engineers who knew about the cement substitutions had families to feed and no legal protection, and had made the painful kind of calculation, the kind made not out of greed but out of fear. 2 workers had approached management 3 months ago with concerns about structural safety. Both had been dismissed the following week. The project was running 4 months behind schedule because funds allocated to acceleration had been redirected somewhere that left no paper trail on the site level. Every night, Musa wrote. Every morning, he carried iron rods and watched. On the 14th day, Sophia came again, Tuesday. He had not consciously tracked the days between her visits, which meant he had tracked them carefully. She set up at the water station, and this time when he passed, she looked up and said, "How is the hand?" "Healed," he said. "Let me see." He stopped. He held his hand. She unwrapped the bandage quickly with practiced fingers and examined the skin beneath. The cut had closed cleanly. "Good," she said. "You cleaned it properly. You gave good instructions." A very small smile, gone almost before it arrived. She rewrapped the hand lightly and returned to her patient, which was a dismissal so natural he almost did not recognize it as one. He stood there a beat longer than he should have. "Malam," she said without looking up, "you are blocking the light." He moved. That evening, after the site emptied and the foreman drove away in his 2 new pickup truck, Musa walked through the unfinished structures of Section D, the residential units designated for the lowest income bracket of the housing allocation. He had designed these himself, smaller square footage but dignified, proper ventilation, structural standards that exceeded minimum code because the families who would live here deserved the same margins of safety as the ones who could afford to complain if they didn't get them. What he found made something cold move through his chest. Load-bearing walls in 3 units, walls that were supposed to carry the weight of the upper floor, had been finished with compromised material. He could see it in the color variation where it met the structural beam. He could feel it in the texture. He had been in construction long enough to know what proper curing looked like, and this was not it. These walls, if the upper floor was completed as designed, would be under stress they were not built to handle. He sat down on the raw floor of the empty unit and stared at the wall for a long time. Sophia's father had died in a collapsed building. She had mentioned it once, briefly, with the compressed delivery of someone who had learned to carry a grief by making it efficient. She had not said where, she had not said which building, but she had said that it was the reason she knew how to identify structural corner cutting the moment she walked into any construction space. She had educated herself after, the way people educate themselves after a loss that should not have happened. She had said it simply without asking anything in return for the information. Musa thought about 800 families on an allocation list who didn't know that the walls of their future homes were lying to them. He thought about the 47 million naira. He thought about the man in the private car who came every week with cash for Tunde. And then he thought about the commissioning ceremony, the grand launch event that his company's PR team had scheduled for 5 weeks from now, when politicians and media and investors would gather at this very site to celebrate the completion of something that was not, in any meaningful sense, complete, where his own executives, the ones he now suspected with documented certainty, would stand on a stage and smile for cameras. He opened his notebook. He wrote 1 line, 5 weeks, enough. He closed the notebook. Outside, a child somewhere in the adjacent neighborhood was laughing at something, the pure, unguarded laughter of someone who had not yet learned to be careful about it. The sound traveled through the open walls of the empty unit, like something that belonged to a different world entirely. Musa Idris pressed his back against a compromised wall in a building he owned and let himself feel for exactly 60 seconds the full weight of what it meant to have built an empire on the assumption that proximity to power guaranteed integrity. It did not. He had learned that now from the ground up, which is, I suppose, the only direction that lesson ever truly arrived. He stood, he brushed the dust from his kaftan, he walked back to his mattress in the unfinished unit on the north end, lay down, and stared at the ceiling with the precise, patient attention of a man who was no longer only gathering evidence. He was also, though he had not yet found language for it, beginning to grieve something. Not money, not reputation, something quieter and more personal, the version of himself that believed knowing the right people was the same as knowing the right things. On the 20th day, Sophia brought him food without being asked. She arrived at the end of her rounds carrying a covered plate, a portion of jollof rice and fried plantain wrapped in foil to hold the heat. She handed it to him with no explanation, as if it were a routine transaction. "You did not eat at midday, I noticed." He took the plate, he looked at it, then he looked at her. "Why are you watching whether I eat?" he asked. She tilted her head slightly. "Because someone should, and no one else on this site appears to be doing it." She turned to pack her bag. Musa sat with the plate in his hands and felt something shift in the architecture of his chest, something structural, something that had been under tension for a long time, ease very slightly, like a knot that had been pulled one direction for so long that it forgotten there was another direction available. He ate every grain of rice on that plate. The conversation that changed everything began over a cracked thermos of tea. It was the 23rd day. The site had emptied early because a delivery truck had failed to arrive, shutting down the afternoon pour, and the foreman had dismissed half the crew by 3 o'clock. Safia had finished her rounds and was repacking her bag near the water station when Musa approached, carrying 2 tin cups and the thermos that old Malam Bello kept near the generator and shared without being asked. "Tea," Musa said. Safia looked at the cups, then at him. "You are bribing me." "For what?" I have not decided yet. But she took the cup. They sat on adjacent concrete blocks at the edge of the site, where the unfinished perimeter wall gave way to open ground and you could see the last of the afternoon light spreading itself thinly across the red Kaduna earth. It was the kind of light that made everything look briefly significant. The dust, the scaffolding, the distant line of low rooftops, all of it gilded just enough to seem like it mattered. Tell me about the housing project, what you know about it, as a worker. He was careful. What do you want to know? Whether the people who built it care about the people who will live in it. She held her cup in both hands and looked at the structure. I have been coming to this site for 3 months. I have treated injuries that should not have happened because safety equipment was insufficient. I have seen the quality of materials change between my visits in ways that concern me. I have spoken to workers who are afraid to raise complaints. She paused. I am asking because I want to know if there is anyone at any level of this project who actually cares, or if it is the usual arrangement, where the people at the top make promises and the people at the bottom absorb the consequences. Musa was quiet for a long moment. The tea was too strong and slightly bitter, the way tea made from the last of a packet always was. The man who designed this project, he said slowly, intended it to be different. He lost sleep over the specifications. He argued with his procurement board over material standards for 6 hours in one meeting. He wanted the drainage systems to exceed code because he had seen what happened to poor housing in flooding season, and he was not willing to put his name on something that would drown in the first rains. Safia looked at him. How do you know that? I read the original plans. He said, technically true. And what happened between the plans and what I see around us? Someone decided that the margin between what was promised and what was delivered was an opportunity, Musa said. Someone decided that the families who would live here had no mechanism to compare what they received with what was intended, and that the distance between those two things was money that could be redirected. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture. My father died in a building like this, Safia said. Not exactly like this. It was older, a residential block in Kaduna South, but the principle was the same. Someone decided that the corner that was cut was not an important corner. He was on the 2nd floor. The ceiling came down. She took a breath that was controlled and very deliberate. I was 17. I had just started secondary school. My mother held the wall of our house for 2 weeks after, like she was afraid it would also fall. Musa did not speak immediately. He understood that certain things required the full weight of a pause before a response was appropriate. I am sorry, he said, and meant it with a specificity that went beyond the social function of the phrase. I do not tell it for sympathy, she said. I tell it because it is the reason I am here, on a construction site twice a week, treating cuts and checking structures and asking questions that are probably not my business. Someone should ask them. It might as well be someone who knows the answer costs when it comes too late. She finished her tea. She stood. She adjusted her bag. The families on that allocation list, she said, not quite to him and not quite to herself, have been waiting 2 years. Most of them are living in overcrowded rentals. Some are paying rent they cannot afford to avoid homelessness. They have placed their faith in a process that has already failed them once in terms of timeline. If it fails them in terms of safety, she stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. She said goodnight and walked to the site gate. Musa sat with his empty cup and the last of the difficult tea and felt something consolidate in him. Not rage exactly, though rage was part of it. Something more purposeful than rage. Rage was reactive. What settled in his chest was architectural, strategic, built to last. He had 5 weeks. He spent the next 10 days moving with doubled intention. He continued his site work, the rod carrying, the structural work at night when the foreman was gone, the quiet conversations with workers who were beginning, cautiously, to trust the quiet laborer who fixed things without being asked and never reported anyone. He gathered 3 additional testimonies, documented carefully, from workers who had witnessed the material substitution directly. He retrieved 2 discarded delivery receipts from the site waste that showed the variance between ordered and delivered materials, evidence that Tunde had apparently considered too ordinary to dispose of carefully. He also spent 2 evenings with Safia. Not by design, or not entirely, she had fallen into a pattern of finishing her rounds and resting near the water station for 20 minutes before the long walk to the main road, and Musa had fallen into the pattern of being in that vicinity at that time. They talked about things that had nothing to do with construction and everything to do with the world that construction was supposed to serve. He told her about a child she had treated at the clinic who had developed respiratory problems from living in a poorly ventilated single room with 6 other people. He told her, carefully framed as abstract observation, about the economics of housing allocation systems and why the lowest income tier always absorbed the highest risk. She listened to him the way she examined wounds, with her full attention turned towards the thing itself, not towards her own response to it. "You speak about these systems like someone who has studied them," she said one evening. "I have read extensively." "In what field?" "Urban development, economics, policy." She tilted her head. "And you are carrying iron rods." "Today I am carrying iron rods," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone assembling a picture from pieces that were arriving out of sequence. Then she appeared to make a decision to leave the picture unfinished for now. "Whatever you are doing here," she said quietly, "I hope it is something that matters." He held her gaze. "It is," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in 3 weeks. Now, if you've been watching this story and feeling every single one of these moments the way they were meant to be felt, drop a comment below right now and tell us, are you Team Safia or are you still shocked by that slap at the beginning? Like this video if Musa's patience is already making you feel something, because the next part of this story is where everything breaks open. Subscribe so you do not miss the moment this hidden billionaire steps back into the light. It was on the 31st day that Aisha returned. She did not come to the site this time. She sent a message through a mutual contact, a careful, strategically worded message that expressed concern for Musa's well-being and suggested a meeting at a neutral location. The mutual contact was Musa's cousin, Farida, who was also the only family member who knew the truth of what Musa was doing and had agreed, with significant personal reservation, to maintain the fiction. Farida delivered the message in person, appearing at the site gate on a Wednesday morning in a car that was slightly too good for the neighborhood, wearing sunglasses that suggested she found the entire situation personally trying. "She wants to meet you," Farida said through the car window, keeping her voice low. "She has heard something that made her reconsider." "What did she hear?" "That you still hold majority shares, that the resignation was not what it appeared. Someone talked, not about the specifics, but enough." Farida's expression was carefully neutral. "She is moving very quickly, Musa. She is trying to reposition before the story changes." Musa thought about the slap, the precision of it, the audience she had calculated before delivering it. "Tell her I am unavailable," he said. Farida almost smiled. "And when she pushes?" "She will push," he agreed. "Tell her I am reconsidering my priorities. That is true enough to be useful." Farida drove away and Musa returned to the site, and that afternoon he received the second piece of information that locked the final picture into place. His legal counsel, Garba, sent a coded message. They had established a simple system through a secondary phone Musa kept wrapped in cloth inside his mattress, confirming that the forensic accountants had traced the diverted funds to a holding account jointly managed by 2 signatories, the CFO, a man named Alhaji Dauda Sule, who had been with the company for 11 years, and a senior board partner named Emeka Ankonkwo, who sat on 3 other real estate boards and whose reputation was, publicly, impeachable. 47 million naira. 2 men, 11 years of earned trust weaponized over 8 months. Musa sat with this information the way he had learned to sit with heavy things in the past month, without rushing toward it, without letting it collapse him, just holding it until its full shape became clear. 11 days. The commissioning ceremony was in 11 days. Garba's message included a secondary note. The board is moving to formally cancel Section D of the housing project. Emergency motion scheduled for next Thursday. They will cite budget overruns. If this motion passes before the ceremony, the cancellation becomes a board resolution, and reversal becomes significantly more complex legally. Next Thursday was in 4 days. Musa unwrapped the secondary phone. He typed a response to Garba. 3 words. Accelerate the preparation. He rewrapped the phone. He lay back on his mattress and stared at the ceiling, and outside, the Kaduna night was warm and full of generator hum and distant music and the specific texture of a city that never fully slept. Somewhere 2 units away, a worker was singing quietly to himself, a song Musa recognized from childhood, something his mother used to play on a cassette player in their kitchen in Zaria before everything became complicated by money and expectation and the particular loneliness of success. He thought about Safiya saying, "Whatever you are doing here, I hope it is something that matters." He thought about her father, the ceiling that came down, his mother holding the wall. He thought about 800 families on a list, waiting. He closed his eyes. 11 days. The morning of the commissioning ceremony arrived the way consequential mornings always do, quietly, without announcement, the sky over Kaduna going from black to gray to a thin, reluctant gold that made the city look almost gentle. Musa had not slept, not because of anxiety, but because he had spent the final hours before dawn reviewing everything one last time with the focused attention of a man who understood preparation was the only honest form of prayer. He was sitting in a different room now. 4 days earlier, after Garba's warning about the emergency board motion, Musa had made 2 calls that ended the undercover chapter of this story with the quiet finality of a door closing. The first call was to his deputy, a sharp, loyally cautious woman named Bilkisu Tonko, who had managed operations in his absence with the kind of competence that made his absence seem, to the outside world, like an expended business trip rather than a vanishing act. The second call was to his security detail, who had spent 31 days professionally miserable in a hotel 2 kilometers from the site, rotating shifts watching a construction worker they were not permitted to approach. The board motion to cancel Section D had been intercepted through a procedural challenge that Garba filed at 11:17 on Thursday morning, 40 minutes before the scheduled vote. The motion was suspended pending a review of the original shareholder agreement, which contained a specific clause, one Musa had personally insisted upon during the company's founding documents, that required unanimous shareholder consent for the cancellation of any community housing designation. Musa held 53% of shares. The motion died before it breathed. Dauda Sule and Emeka Okonkwo did not yet know why. They attributed it to legal bureaucracy and spent the remaining days before the ceremony congratulating themselves on what they still believed was a controlled situation. They were wrong in the specific way that only deeply confident people can be wrong, completely and without suspicion. Now, Musa stood in a hotel suite 4 floors above Kaduna's main boulevard and watched his reflection in a full-length mirror while his tailor made a final adjustment to the agbada, navy blue, hand-embroidered, the kind of garment that announced arrival without speaking a word. His beard was trimmed back to its usual precise shape. His shoes were the particular shade of dark leather that caught light without demanding it. He looked, for the first time in 31 days, like the man his company's annual report said he was. He did not feel like that man. He felt like something between the 2 versions, the laborer and the executive, the man who had eaten roadside beans and the man who had built skyscrapers. He was not sure the two could be fully separated anymore, and he was not sure they should be. The month on the ground had done something to his internal architecture that no boardroom had ever managed. It had made the consequences of his decisions visible, not as statistics on a report, as people, as Sophia's father, as the respiratory child in the clinic, as old Malam Bello's infected arm, and the workers who lowered their eyes when they spoke of safety concerns because lowering their eyes was the price of keeping their jobs. He straightened his collar. "Alaji," his head of security said from the doorway, "the convoy is ready." 5 minutes, Musa said. He picked up his phone. He had one message to send before he left this room. He typed it carefully to the number he had memorized rather than saved, a precaution that now felt almost symbolic given that the person on the other end had seen him at his most deliberately unremarkable. "There is something happening today at the commissioning ceremony that you should witness. Go as yourself, community health representative. Your work with the site workers has already been formally noted. A seat will be arranged. M." He read it back. He almost added something more. He did not. He sent it. He put the phone in his breast pocket. He walked to the door. The housing estate looked different from the outside when you arrived in a convoy. Musa noticed this the way you notice something that reframes everything you thought you understood about a place. He had walked through that gate 31 times in dusty boots. Now he sat in the back of an armored SUV and watched it approach through tinted glass, and the same concrete and scaffolding and red earth that had been the texture of his daily life for a month looked from this angle like an achievement, like something that had been built towards something, which it had been, of course. That had never changed. What had changed was his ability to hold both versions simultaneously, the promise of the design and the reality of the execution, without letting one erase the other. The convoy stopped outside the main entrance. His security detail stepped out first. Musa waited the precise number of seconds that allowed the crowd near the entrance to register that someone significant had arrived without yet knowing who. Then he stepped out. The effect was not immediate. It rippled. It moved through the assembled crowd the way a stone moves water, the point of impact first, then outward in expanding rings of recognition. He watched it happen from inside it. A journalist near the press cordon lowered her camera and raised it again. A politician's aide touched his employer's arm and said something. A cluster of site workers near the perimeter fence went very still. Tunde, the foreman, standing near the main stage with the studied casualness of someone who believed he had nothing to fear, looked up and turned the color of old concrete. Musa walked through the crowd without stopping. His security formed a loose, professional perimeter. He nodded to people who greeted him, the governor's representative, 2 senators he knew personally, a journalist he respected. He did not stop for photographs. He did not stop for anything. Until he saw Sophia. She was standing near the community representative section, still in her blue clinic uniform she had not had time to change or chosen not to, holding a printed program and looking at it with the focused expression of someone trying to understand something. She had not seen him yet. He watched her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he kept walking because this was not the moment, and he understood pacing better than anything else. Aisha was positioned near the VIP section in a cream and gold wrapper that had been selected with strategic precision. She saw him the moment he cleared the main entrance. He watched her process his appearance with the rapid, invisible recalculation of someone who has bet on a particular outcome and just received information that changed the odds. She straightened. She smiled. It was a beautiful, practiced smile that reached precisely to the border of her eyes and stopped there. He acknowledged her with a nod that was technically courteous and emotionally nothing. The ceremony opened with remarks from the state housing commissioner, which were long and self-congratulatory in the specific way of officials who have contributed least to an outcome and feel most entitled to discuss it. Then the company's PR director gave a prepared overview of the project scope. Then a representative of the original investors said 3 sentences that were accurate and sat down. Then the MC, consulting his notes with visible nerves, said, "And now the principal shareholder and founder of Idris Urban Developments will address us. Please welcome." Musa was already walking to the stage. The sound that moved through the crowd was not quite silence. It was the sound of many people breathing differently at the same time. He reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone. He looked over the assembled faces, politicians, investors, journalists, workers, community members, and somewhere in the middle distance, one woman in a blue clinic uniform who had stopped looking at her program and was now looking directly at him with an expression he could not fully read from here, which contained the specific quality of someone whose picture had just completed itself. He did not use the prepared remarks. 31 days ago, he said, and his voice through the speakers was calm and unhurried and carried the particular weight of someone speaking from something they had earned. Walked through that gate as a casual laborer. I carried iron rods. I ate roadside beans. I slept in one of these unfinished units on a thin mattress and listened to this city breathe through the walls. He paused. Today, I have answers to both questions. He nodded to Garba, who was standing at the left of the stage. Garba lifted a hand. Two things happened simultaneously. 4 members of the Economic Crimes Commission, who had been present since morning in civilian clothes and who had spent the ceremony standing in positions that now made complete sense, moved with quiet efficiency toward Alhaji Dauda Sule and Emeka Okonkwo, who were seated in the 3rd row of the VIP section and who had, until this precise moment, believed they were attending a celebration. The second thing that happened was that a large screen behind Musa's podium activated, displaying the forensic financial documentation, account numbers, transfer records, timestamps, and the names of 2 signatories in the clean, unambiguous language of evidence. The third thing, he had not planned this one, it happened of its own logic, that Tunde the foreman turned and walked very quickly toward the perimeter fence and was intercepted by 2 people before he reached it. Dauda Sule said something. Emeka Okonkwo said nothing. The commission officers were professional and unhurried. The thing was done in under 60 seconds, the way genuine authority operates, without theater, without cruelty, simply and completely. The crowd erupted. Musa waited at the podium. He was not performing composure, he simply had it. When the noise reduced to something manageable, he continued. The housing project will be completed. Section D will not be canceled. The families on the allocation list will receive what was promised to them, materials to the original specification, structures to the original standard, a timeline that begins immediately. He looked out over the crowd. This company was built on a principle that I allowed to be compromised by placing too much trust in proximity and not enough in verification. That changes today. An independent ethics board with external oversight will govern procurement from this point forward. Community representatives will have a formal role in that structure. He paused again. The woman who helped design that community component, who gave her time to this site and these workers without being asked and without being compensated, is Safiya Yusuf. She will lead the Community Housing Safety Initiative going forward if she accepts the position. He looked toward the community representative section. Safiya? Every head in the crowd turned. She was standing very still with her program folded in half in her hands and an expression that was not shock exactly. It was something more complicated than shock. It was the expression of someone who has been seen so completely and so publicly that the ordinary responses to being seen have been bypassed entirely. She held his gaze. She did not nod yet, but she did not look away. Aisha moved through the crowd toward Musa before he had left the stage. She was practiced at arriving at the right moment, and this was a skill Musa had once admired. Musa, her voice was low, textured with exactly the right degree of warmth and contrition. What you have done today is, I cannot describe it. I am so proud of you. I want you to know that I never truly believed. Aisha, he said, gently, not unkindly, the way you set something down that you have been carrying for too long. She stopped. You loved access, he said, not me. I do not hold that against you. Access is a reasonable thing to love, but it is not what I need. He looked at her with the full, clear-eyed attention of a man who has spent 31 days learning to see without the distortion of what things were supposed to mean. I wish you well, genuinely. He stepped around her. He walked toward the community representative section where Sophia was still standing, still holding her folded program, still wearing the expression that had bypassed ordinary responses. He stopped in front of her. You lied, she said. Yes. For 31 days. Yes. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes that had never once arranged themselves to accommodate what he wanted to see. And the tea, the concrete blocks, the conversations were real, he said. Everything I told you was true. I only omitted the title. The title is not a small thing to omit. No, he agreed, it is not. A long pause. Around them, the crowd was reforming itself into the excited, speculative clusters of people processing an event they would describe for years. Journalists were moving, cameras were pointed. None of it touched the 2 feet of air between Musa and Sophia. Why me? At the ceremony? Why announce it like that? He considered the honest answer for exactly as long as it took to find it. Because you were the only person on that site who ever asked whether anyone cared about the people who would live here, and because you already knew the answer should be yes before you asked, and because... He stopped. He looked at her. Because the position is real, and so is everything else. Her eyes moved over his face with the particular attention she gave to things that required careful assessment. I will need to think about the position, she said finally. Of course. And the everything else. Also, of course. The smallest possible curvature appeared at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, a promise of one. You still owe me a proper apology, Musa, she said. I know, he said. I intend to take my time with it. 6 months is enough time for the truth to settle into the shape it was always meant to hold. The housing estate in Kaduna's eastern corridor opened on a Thursday morning in early Harmattan, when the air carried that particular dry clarity that made distances seem shorter and colors more honest. 812 families received keys on that day, not vouchers, not allocation letters with asterisks attached, actual keys to actual units, with walls built to the original specification and drainage systems that exceeded minimum code, and ventilation designed by someone who had argued about it for 6 hours in a boardroom because the people who would breathe that air deserved the same margin of safety as people who could afford to complain if they did not get it. Musa stood at the edge of the compound and watched it happen. He was not on a stage. He had declined the ceremonial role that the state housing commissioner had offered him with the eager, slightly desperate generosity of an official who needed to be associated with a successful outcome after 2 years of delays. Musa had thanked him and suggested the stage be given to the families themselves, some of whom had been waiting since before their youngest children were born. The commissioner had looked briefly confused and then agreed, in the way that people agree to things when the person asking has 53% of the relevant shares. So the stage belonged to the families, and the cameras pointed at a woman named Hajia Ramatu, 61 years old, who had been on the allocation list for 38 months and who stood at the microphone with her key held in both hands like something sacred and said, simply, Allah ya bless the ones who remembered us, and then could not continue for a moment and did not need to because the crowd understood the sentence completely. Musa watched this. He felt it move through him the way things move through you when they are real. Not the clean, cinematic emotion of a manufactured moment, but the complicated, slightly uncomfortable feeling of something that matters pressing against something that previously only thought it mattered. He had built skyscrapers. He had negotiated contracts that moved hundreds of millions across borders. He had sat in rooms where the decisions made affected tens of thousands of lives in ways those lives would never know to trace back to that room. He had believed, in the way that people believe things that have never been tested, that the scale of what he built was a measure of the significance of what he did. Hajia Ramatu's key. That was the measure. He understood this now with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 31 days living inside the consequences of their own decisions without the buffer of a title to absorb the impact. Sophia appeared at his elbow, which she had a talent for, arriving without announcement as if she had simply always been there and he was only now noticing. "She has been waiting 3 years," Sophia said, watching Hajia Ramatu. "She told me once that she stopped letting herself imagine what the unit would look like because imagining it and not having it was worse than not imagining it at all. And now? Now she is repainting it in her head in real time." Sophia's voice carried the quiet warmth of someone who finds other people's joy genuinely nourishing rather than something to perform appreciation for. "She asked me yesterday whether the kitchen window faces east. She wants morning light. She has wanted morning light in her kitchen for 3 years. Musa said nothing for a moment. "Does it face east?" "It does." He breathed. They stood together in the Harmattan light and watched families move through the estate with the particular energy of people inhabiting something for the first time. Children running ahead of parents, older women touching walls with careful palms as if confirming solidity, men standing in doorways with the expression of people measuring a space against a hope and finding the measurement adequate. It was ordinary, and it was enormous, the way most things that actually matter are. The ethics board had been constituted 6 weeks after the commissioning ceremony, with 3 external members drawn from legal, civil society, and academic backgrounds, and 2 community representatives, of whom Sophia was one. Its first act had been a full, independent audit of all active Idris urban developments projects. Its second had been the establishment of a workers' safety reporting mechanism with guaranteed anonymity and a direct channel to the board that bypassed the management layer entirely. Its third had been a recommendation that Musa had implemented without hesitation, a retroactive compensation package for the workers dismissed after raising safety concerns, with letters of formal apology and offers of reinstatement. Both workers had taken the reinstatement. Dauda Sule and Emeka Okonkwo were in the custody of the Economic Crimes Commission and would remain so pending trial, which Garba estimated would begin in 4 months and conclude, given the quality of the documented evidence, in a direction that was not favorable to men who stole from families that could not afford lawyers. Tunde the foreman had been dismissed, prosecuted separately for materials fraud, and was cooperating with investigators in the way that people cooperate when cooperation is the only available currency they have left. The 2 site engineers who knew and said nothing, the ones who made the calculation born of fear rather than greed, were retained, with formal acknowledgement in their employment records of the circumstances that compromised their ability to act. Musa had made this decision himself, against the advice of one member of his legal team, and he stood by it. He understood now, in a way he had not before the 31 days, that systems create the conditions for the choices people make inside them. You couldn't punish men for being afraid of a foreman's brother-in-law without also examining why the structure made that fear rational. You fixed the structure, you gave people the conditions to be better than the system had allowed them to be, then you held them to it. The site engineers had not been the problem. He had been part of the problem, the part that had built a company on the assumption that his values would transmit downward through organizational layers without architecture to carry them. The assumption was wrong. He had accepted this. Old Malambello was among the 812 families who received keys. Musa had not known this until 3 days before the ceremony, when Sophia, reviewing the final allocation list as part of her community advocate role, had found the name and brought it to him with the quiet expression of someone delivering information they consider significant. He had stood in the site office, a real office now with working electricity and a proper door, and read Malambello's name on the list and felt something he could not immediately name, something that required him to set the list down and look at the wall for a moment. So he was on the original list from the beginning, Sophia said. 38 months. Musa thought about the old man's infected arm, the way he had held it out to Sophia with the patient dignity of someone who had learned not to expect things to be easy, the way he had shared his thermos without being asked. Make sure his unit is inspected personally before the keys are distributed. I want someone to walk it with him. I already arranged it. Of course she had. This was, Musa had discovered over 6 months, one of Sophia's defining characteristics. She did not wait for permission to do the right thing, and she did not announce it afterward. She simply did it and moved to the next thing that needed doing. It was the quality he had noticed first on the construction site, when she had arrived with her medical bag and her covered pot and her full attention and no expectation of being celebrated for any of it. It was the quality he continued to discover in the weeks and months that followed, in contexts that ranged from ethics board meetings to the quiet evenings they had begun spending together, with the natural inevitability of 2 schedules gradually reorganizing themselves around each other. The apology he had promised her took 3 attempts. The first attempt she interrupted to correct a factual error in one of their conversations from the site. The second she listened to in full and then said that it was thorough but felt like a legal document, which was accurate. The third he abandoned the prepared version entirely and simply told her in ordinary language without structure what the 31 days had shown him and what it had cost him to understand and what it had given him that he had not known he was missing. She listened to this one without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "That is better," and poured them both tea, and that was the end of the apology and the beginning of something that did not require a name yet to be real. They were not rushed about it. This was perhaps the most significant gift of the previous 6 months. Neither of them was performing a timeline. They were simply present in the actual pace of something building honestly. She accepted the Community Housing Safety Initiative position the day after the commissioning ceremony, in a letter that was 3 paragraphs long and professional, and that in its final sentence contained the line, "I accept this position on the understanding that my role includes full authority to escalate concerns directly to the board without management review, and that the work we did in those conversations on the site, the real work, the kind without titles, continues to inform the structure of everything that follows." He read that sentence 4 times. He wrote back, agreed on all of it. Now, the Harmattan morning spread itself across the estate, and families moved through their new beginnings, and Malambello appeared at the gate in a clean embroidered caftan, his son on one arm and his daughter-in-law on the other, holding his key with the same careful dignity with which he had held out his injured arm, patient, undemanding, quietly certain that things were as they should be. Musa walked over to him. The old man looked up and studied Musa's face with the focused attention of someone whose eyes had grown accustomed to reading people rather than documents. "So," Malambello said, "you were the owner." "I was," Musa said. The old man was quiet for a moment, considering this. Then, "The tea was good, though." Musa laughed. It came from somewhere unguarded, and it surprised him slightly, the way real laughter does when it arrives without announcement. "The tea was terrible, Malam. It was the last of the packet." "The last of the packet always has the most flavor," the old man said with the unassailable confidence of someone who has lived long enough to make their preferences into philosophy. He patted Musa's arm once. Then he walked through the gate with his family. Sophia's had appeared beside Musa again. She watched the old man go. "He is right about the tea," she said. "You are both wrong about the tea," Musa said. "Noted," she said. "We will revisit this." He looked at her. She was watching the estate with that expression of full attention that he had first noticed at the water station, the one that gave itself completely to what was in front of it without reservation or performance. The morning light was specific and honest on her face. She had not changed her clinic uniform for this event either, because she had come from rounds and had not had time and had not considered it a problem worth solving, because she did not arrange herself for occasions. He found this, as he found most things about her, uncomplicated in its significance. The small wedding in Zaria happened on a Saturday in the season between Harmattan and the first rains, when the air carried the anticipatory quality of something about to change. There were no politicians, there were no media invitations. There was Musa's mother, who had waited long enough and with enough dignified patience that her presence at the front of the room carried the weight of a judgment finally delivered. There was Farida, who had maintained the fiction of Musa's collapse for 31 days and considered herself therefore to be personally responsible for the outcome, and was not incorrect. There was Garba, who wore the expression of a man who had handled unusual legal requests for 2 decades and considered this to be the best outcome of all of them. There were workers from the site. 7 of them had driven up from Kaduna in a single vehicle, arriving 2 hours early and sitting quietly in the courtyard until someone brought them food, which Musa's mother did without being asked, because that was the household from which Musa had learned to notice when people needed something and provide it without ceremony. Sophia's mother sat beside Musa's mother through the ceremony in the particular silence of 2 women who have each carried significant things alone and recognized that quality in each other without needing to discuss it. There were no speeches. There was food and there was music, and there was the specific warmth of a room full of people who were there because they genuinely wished to be, rather than because it was professionally advisable. At some point in the evening, Musa stood near the window of his mother's house and watched the courtyard where his workers and his family moved through the same space without the hierarchical self-consciousness of people who knew where they ranked relative to each other, and he felt the full weight of what the previous year had rearranged in him. Sophia found him there. She handed him a cup of tea. He looked at it. "Is this also the last of the packet?" "Obviously," she said. He drank it. It was genuinely terrible. "Sophia," he said. "Thank you." She looked at him with those direct eyes. "For what specifically?" "For the jollof rice on the 20th day, when you brought it without being asked." She was quiet for a moment. "Someone should," she said. It was the same thing she had said that day, word for word, without apparent awareness of the echo. She meant it the same way she had meant it then, simply and completely, without asking for anything back. He had built skyscrapers all his life, towers of glass and steel and ambition, visible from great distances, designed to be seen from below and to make the people below feel the scale of what had been achieved above them. He had built things that appeared in architecture journals and city development reports and investment portfolios. He had built things that would stand for decades after he was gone. But the strongest foundation he had ever laid was not in any of those buildings. It was in a month of dust and iron rods and roadside beans, in a cracked thermos shared on a concrete block, in a cut hand and an honest bandage, in the conversations that happened when nobody was watching and nobody was performing, and the only thing being built was something that did not have a blueprint. Truth, that was the foundation, and love, the kind that had never once asked what the title was. He looked out at the courtyard. Children were running through it now, appearing from somewhere in the way children appear at celebrations, as if summoned by the energy of adults being happy. They ran with the particular reckless joy of people who had not yet learned to moderate their pleasure for the comfort of observers. He watched them. He thought of Hajiara Matu's kitchen window facing east, morning light, 3 years of waiting for morning light. He thought of Malam Bello's patient dignity, of Sophia's father and the ceiling that came down, of the 2 workers who had raised safety concerns and been dismissed and reinstated, of 812 keys. He held his terrible tea and stood beside his wife in his mother's house in Zaria when the evening moved through its hours, and he felt not the clean, dramatic emotion of a man at the peak of an achievement, but something quieter and more permanent, the feeling of someone who has finally, after a long and complicated journey, arrived somewhere true. Outside, a child laughed at something, the pure, unguarded laughter of someone who had not yet learned to be careful about it. This time, Musa Idris let himself laugh with them. If this story reached something real inside you, if Musa's patience moved you, if Sophia's strength stayed with you, if the moment those keys were handed over made you feel something you were not expecting to feel, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Subscribe right now, turn on every notification, and tell us in the comments, what was the moment that broke you open? Was it the slap? Was it the jollof rice on day 20? Was it Malam Bello and his terrible tea? We read every single comment. Like this video so that this story reaches someone else who needs it today. And share it, because somewhere out there is a person who needs to be reminded that the strongest foundations are always built from truth. The story of Musa Idris is complete, but the next hidden king is already waiting. Stay close.